Sourcing is the act of transferring work from one to another. Outsourcing is the act of transferring the work to an external party. Whether or not to outsource is the decision of whether to make or buy. Organizations are continuously faced with the decision of whether to expend resources to create an asset, resource, product, or service internally, or to buy it from an external party. If the organization chooses to buy, it is engaging in outsourcing. An outsourcing initiative calls for the transfer of factors of production, the resources used to perform the work, and the decision rights or responsibilities for making decisions. The organization transferring these is referred to as the client. The organization that conducts the work and makes decisions is the vendor, and the scope of the work is captured in a project. Let's start with the client. A client is the person or organization that would like to outsource a given project. Normally, this entity is thinking about utilizing outsourcing as a strategic tool. Clients can range in scope and size. A client can be an entire organization or a unit within an organization. If the project being outsourced is the entire IT department of the company, we can say that the organization is the client. However, if we are only outsourcing the payroll functionality of the human resource department, the client is the human resource department, though indirectly the entire organization is also the client. The vendor is the service provider who will take over and conduct the outsourced work. Vendors come in many shapes and sizes. For instance, a vendor can be an external organization, which is most often the case. However, a vendor can also be a subsidiary of the organization. Vendors can be differentiated based on where they are located. Some vendors are located onshore or in the same area as the client. Others are located nearshore, as in the case of potential Canadian companies for US clients. Finally, vendors can be offshore, as in the case of Indian companies for British clients. The third component is the actual work being outsourced. In the past, the most common form of such work was manufacturing or labor-intensive projects. Today, however, there is a move towards the outsourcing of more complex forms of work, such as software development or R&D. These projects differ from the old manufacturing projects in several ways. First, they are more loosely defined than manufacturing projects. Putting together a software project involves much more creativity than running a basic assembly line to make a piece of clothing for which there are pre-specified guidelines. Second, since the work involves more knowledge-intensive tasks, it requires the use of a more skilled labor force. Third, most projects today are most complex owing to the way communications are handled using IT, the cross-functional nature of project teams, and the presence of multiple stakeholders, many of whom may be in different locations and may work for different companies. Outsourcing projects also involves one more important feature: collaborations between organizations that do not necessarily share the same interest or goals. The client organization will normally want to get the work done at the most superior quality for the lowest possible price. The vendor wants to maximize its revenues from the project. These differences in objectives, if not managed appropriately during the contracting and negotiating phases of the outsourcing lifecycle, will result in a disastrous business relationship. Outsourcing has moved from initiatives that were financially motivated to the current stage of being strategically motivated. Financially motivated outsourcing efforts have been around since the early days of commerce. Manufacturing work such as garment production has long been outsourced to locations in Southeast Asia. The goal of these efforts was to get the best financial deal in terms of lowest cost of production. These efforts were mainly one-sided. Information and requirements moved from the client to the vendor, who would then construct the product and/or service and deliver this back to the client. Information and knowledge would seldom flow back from the vendor to the client, as the client was assumed to be more knowledgeable than the vendor. In financially driven outsourcing efforts, it was common for a firm to structure a long-term deal with a single vendor so as to get the best possible discounts and secure the most stable relationship. After all, the goal here was to offload work to places where it could be done at lower cost. Strategically driven outsourcing efforts are capability and competency intensive. The focus here is to tap into specialized expertise, knowledge, processes, and capabilities found outside the organization and to use these as inputs to help improve the effectiveness and efficiency of operations. More important, if done properly, strategically driven outsourcing efforts can not only help operations but can also contribute to the strategic and competitive advantages of the organization. There are several factors that are influencing firms to consider outsourcing as a business strategy, as shown in this figure. We will now explore some of them, recognizing the fact that some firms may be influenced more by some of these factors than others. Let's start with the access to resources and knowledge, which is very important, not the ownership. The earlier, thinking about the ownership of factors of production for securing competitive advantages is outdated. Today, the more important detail is how an organization can access external resources and knowledge rather than trying to own the resources. No organization is self-sufficient. Being self-sufficient is not economically viable for a basic reason: opportunity cost, which is the value derived from the best alternative use of a resource. If organizations try to do everything and spend all their resources to create expertise, skills, and technology, they are underutilizing their resources. Other firms in the marketplace may be able to provide them access to necessary resources at lower cost than it would make them to produce these resources. Moreover, sometimes the resources provided by external parties may be of far superior quality than organizations can produce internally. There are many cases of outsourcing agreements where relationships are forged not just for basic cost saving, but to get access to needed expertise, skills, and technology. The bottom line is that innovative knowledge is required in almost all areas of operations for a business, but the cost of creating this knowledge is significant. Hence, rather than expending resources to create such knowledge, organizations are purchasing this knowledge from external sources. Cost savings. The predominant reason given for engaging in outsourcing is the cost savings, which are realized in several ways. First, cost savings can come from the simple move from fixed to variable cost models. In the fixed cost model, you own all the resources and have to pay for their acquisition, upkeep, and maintenance. These costs are fixed and occur no matter if you use the resource or not. For example, if you own a car, you have certain fixed costs regardless of how much you drive it, such as maintenance or parking. If you drive the vehicle, then your expenses, such as fuel, increase. Under the variable cost model, you do not incur the fixed costs associated with maintaining the asset, but only pay a fee when you use the assets or access them, such as when renting a car. You are bound to save some costs when moving from fixed to variable cost, especially when the resources you use are not needed on a regular basis. Second, cost savings can come from the company doing the outsourced work. In the case of software development, most of the current outsourcing is occurring with companies in the so-called developing world. Here the wages and cost of labor are quite low compared to those in Western Europe or the States. The savings in salaries can be significant, as in most IT projects, labor costs comprise the greatest proportion of the cost. Third, other cost savings could result from beneficial tax treaties and other foreign trade agreements, wherein governments may encourage multinational and international corporations to open up businesses in the developing countries by giving tax concessions and other setup benefits. Focus on core competences. Outsourcing not only involves the transfer of work, but also the transfer of decision rights. By transferring decision rights, the organization is reducing its need to focus high levels of resources on the effort of decision making. The vendor takes on the responsibility for decision making and is held accountable for the decision outcomes about achieving project goals. Transferring decision rights and accountability allows the client to pay more attention to its core competences. Without engaging in outsourcing, the organization will perhaps not focus on areas in which it should invest manager attention and effort. Every organization has its core competences. Some have better developed and mature ones, and this is what makes them industry leaders. When engaging in outsourcing, it is absolutely essential that the client organization is able to tap into the core competency of the vendor, not just for the simple task of sourcing the work, but also for knowledge. Knowledge from the vendor, especially in the area of the core competency, can help the client re-architect, redesign, and re-engineer its business processes so as to better suit it to achieve greater competitive advantages. This has been the critical shift in focus over recent years, as outsourcing efforts become more mature. Clients are no longer looking only for cost economies, but also for a business partner who can contribute to the strategic efforts of the company by providing it with expertise and competences that are not found in-house. An outcome of being able to focus on core competences is that it allows the organization to rethink its organization structure and restructure or realign itself. Think about narrowing down your long to-do list and prioritizing it by items that are urgent and central and those that are peripheral. Doing this will help clean up your view of what needs to be done immediately and what can wait. Organizations are too often busy doing things, and sometimes they do so at the expense of stopping to think about whether what is being done is indeed the most important or beneficial for the future of the organization. Getting focused on what really matters, the core competences, and outsourcing the rest helps the organization better manage its activities. In some cases, an organization may have too many core competences to focus on, and may even decide to outsource a handful of them to external vendors who may be able to do the work at lower cost and or better. Global outsourcing. The business practice of offshoring focuses on the relocation of labor-intensive service industry functions to locations remote to the business centers such as India, Ireland, or the Philippines. Two main changes in the business environment have enabled offshoring. First, the improvement in international telecommunications capacity and the associated reduction in global telecommunications costs is fundamental to the economics of offshoring. Second, and just as important, over the past 2 decades, the PC has enabled the computerization and digitization of most business services. As a result of these two changes, information can now be transmitted over long distances at very low cost and with little or no loss of quality. These changes make organizational boundaries and national borders much less important in deciding the location of service functions. Factors that are really enabling global outsourcing include growing pools of a highly skilled, educated workforce available, for example. Candidates have philosophy doctors and master's degrees in computer science and in computer engineering and are well experienced in this area. Another consideration is the state-of-the-art facilities and infrastructure that are available out there in the global marketplace. Another factor that has contributed to the increase in global outsourcing is the sophistication of collaborative technology solutions. Today we have a wide array of devices that can be used to communicate with our counterparts across the globe. Mobile phones, email, video conferencing, web conferencing, and instant messaging are a few of the gamut of collaborative tools available. The cost of such tools have decreased sizably over the years. In some cases, they are even available for free. Types of outsourcing. There is a wide assortment of outsourcing categories and models, each with its own strengths and weaknesses and management concerns. Outsourcing efforts can be segmented by location, where the work is done on-site or off-site. On-site work involves having members of the vendor's team conduct work within the premises of the client organization. Off-site work is where the vendor conducts work at its location. Within off-site work arrangements, work can be onshore, nearshore, and offshore. Onshore is where a vendor conducts work within the same country as the client. In some of the rural areas of the United States, especially around settlements and reservations of American Indian tribes in places like South Dakota, North Dakota, and parts of Utah, we have been seeing the emergence of consulting firms that are attractive vendors for onshore outsourcing of IT work. These organizations can price their services somewhere in between what is charged to do the work in the major cities in the States and the prices charged by offshore vendors. The cost of living for employees is low and there is availability of skilled labor to draw on. One of the clear benefits of outsourcing to an onshore location is the fact that there are fewer cultural issues to contend with. Language issues and work disruptions owing to significant time differences are minimized. The use of onshore vendors is particularly attractive when the work being outsourced is of a sensitive nature, such as work dealing with medical or financial information, where there are regulations in place that prevent it being sent to offshore vendors owing to security and privacy risks. Nearshore arrangements in the States involve moving work outside the country to neighboring locations. For example, a lot of US companies have begun to use Canadian companies as viable business partners in call centers and software development projects. Similarly, West European countries have begun to explore the talent pool in Russia and some of the emerging East European nations for outsourcing work. Besides the cost advantage of doing work in the nearshore location, there are other advantages including no major cultural differences, cheaper travel and communication costs, and no major time zone differences, which prevents disruption of work and eases work patterns. Finally, there are offshore arrangements where work is sent to countries that are at considerable distance from the client. For example, India has become the dominant country for the outsourcing of software work. Organizations in the States, the UK, Canada, and Australia, among other countries, have outsourcing projects with Indian companies. As discussed, there are several key factors that make offshoring of work an attractive proposition. Outsourcing projects can also be segmented by their depth level, individual, functional, or competency. Individual outsourcing involves outsourcing specific positions out of the company. Examples include the outsourcing of positions such as competitive intelligence analyst, web designer, or public relations personnel. This is the simplest form of outsourcing, as the organization is engaging in the hiring of a single staff function, much like hiring a full-time consultant. Organizations engage in individual outsourcing when they need expertise in a niche area and for a specific time period. For instance, consider the case of a web designer. The chances are that the organization is not going to make major overhauls to its website on a daily basis. The organization, however, would like to keep its website current by adding new items such as current news and happenings. To handle this task, a full-time web designer working the stipulated 40 hours a week is not required. The organization is best served by outsourcing this function to a person who can be paid on an hourly basis and be called upon as needed to make updates to the website. Functional outsourcing involves the outsourcing of an individual functional area, also known as a cost center. Outsourcing of accounts payable, purchasing, receiving, and payroll are all examples of functional outsourcing. Functional outsourcing can be considered an amalgamation or higher order version of individual outsourcing. Here the organization has decided to outsource an entire domain of work, most commonly motivated by cost savings and superior expertise possessed by vendors. The third parties are able to deliver the service at low cost because of economies of scale, and it is in their best interest to keep updated with new tax and human resource laws in order to function effectively. Competency outsourcing involves outsourcing of activities that control how products and services flow through the organization. Examples include inbound logistics, technology development, and human resource management. Competency outsourcing is the higher order construct of functional outsourcing, as it involves the outsourcing of multiple functions. Here the organization must have a great deal of trust and confidence in the vendor organization's ability to deliver on the project, as there will be serious negative impacts if work stoppage or other delivery issues arise. Outsourcing efforts can also be classified by examining the nature of work, whether it is process-oriented or project-oriented work. Process-oriented work usually involves the outsourcing of a well-structured, standardized, and documented process, for example, outsourcing of a payroll function. Project-oriented work, on the other hand, involves the outsourcing of unique and non-routine, unstructured and non-standardized work, for example, software development. Process-oriented outsourcing is easier to manage as it involves a structured process and one that organizations understand fairly well, thereby making it easier to manage. Project-oriented work is most often more laborious to manage as organizations do not quite understand all the intricacies of the work, and there is greater risk in handling work where managers have neither the necessary information nor deep experience. Skills needed to manage outsourcing efforts. In order to be successful at leading outsourcing efforts, you must develop certain competencies. Of the many skills that you may possess, here are a few that you may want to sharpen or start oiling. Good decision-making in high uncertainty environments is a critical skill when managing outsourcing efforts. While outsourcing initiatives are not entirely novel to organizations, their complexity, risk, and impact on organizations has never been higher. A consequent factor of this is the need to make decisions in uncertain environments. You must be able to make decisions with incomplete information, have the foresight to plan ahead using scenarios, think through various alternatives, and most importantly, find ways to reduce the uncertainty associated with making decisions. Following a process-driven and structured approach to outsourcing will help this effort by providing you with a set of tools and techniques that can be used to journey through the uncharted outsourcing waters. Through experiences with outsourcing, you will learn how to ask the right questions, seek out the right information, and synthesize information in a time-sensitive manner in order to make swift decisions. Marketing and positioning skills are also vital. Outsourcing efforts require an organization to embrace change. Most of the time, this change is not pleasant to communicate to employees, as they have to give up their comfort zones of operations and begin operating under new premises. In some cases, they may not even have a job when the changes include right-sizing or downsizing. Hence, it is very important to have good marketing and selling skills. You must be able to convince your audience about your idea and, more importantly, rally support behind it. This is especially vital when seeking senior management support. Without adequate marketing skills, it will be difficult to position the outsourcing strategy as a win-win situation. If this doesn't happen, rest assured that your outsourcing efforts will be in vain, as it takes dedicated effort on the part of a large number of individuals to make outsourcing a success, and they must first be convinced that the idea genuinely merits their dedicated work. Negotiating and relationship building skills are essential for building a good outsourcing relationship with your vendors. Much like what is said about genius, outsourcing efforts are 5% inspiration and 95% perspiration. Much of the perspiration comes from engaging in long and sometimes grueling meetings with vendors, where details of the outsourcing project are ironed out and the contracts are specified. Once the outsourcing project is underway, you need to expel efforts to ensure that what was agreed upon is actually occurring. To do this successfully, it is important that you have excellent negotiating skills and can manage the relationship so as to attain the organizational objectives with minimal hostilities with the vendor. Finally, it is important to have knowledge management skills. In our experience, there is one factor that challenges most executives in outsourcing efforts: dealing with multiple sources of data, information, and knowledge. On any matter regarding outsourcing, you are bound to have more perspectives than you care for. Some of these perspectives come from speaking to your staff, others come from external sources, such as vendors, reading business magazines, talking to peers, listening to academics, and even surfing the internet. The end result is information overload. You become paralyzed by the barrage of information and cannot execute a coherent strategy. It is important to possess a vast breadth of knowledge about the organization and its industry, to be able to articulate clearly the organization's mission, its value statements, core competences, key stakeholders, and their interests, and its future expansion plans. Then you need to have a team of experts who have the necessary deep knowledge in the domains and must rely on their counsel to manage the outsourcing effort. You must be able to manage conflicts in information from different sources and also be able to triangulate incoming information so as to ensure that the information being acted on is the most reliable, complete, and credible at any point. In the final analysis, an executive tasked with managing outsourcing efforts must be able to put all skills and expertise into turbo boost or overdrive. Unfortunately, there are no colleges or degrees that can certify an executive as an outsourcing manager. Most executives assume this role after a background in a given domain, whether it is finance, management, information systems, procurement, etc. Outsourcing cuts through multiple functional areas, so the onus of breaking through silo-based thinking lies with the executive. This thinking may have worked when overseeing a functional domain, but to manage an outsourcing effort, an executive needs to grasp the big picture of the entire company. In this field, probably do a much better job of security on an ongoing basis, a phenomenon that will increase as companies reduce staff and training expenses. Organizations must carefully examine and mitigate risk, as a single significant episode has the potential to shut down the business. Failure to tap into external sources of knowledge. Most organizations fail to recognize the complexities and business ramifications of their outsourcing decisions. Consequently, they rely exclusively on internal resources to guide the organization through the initiative, even though they lack the internal expertise required to make their outsourcing initiative successful. Organizations must ask themselves whether they have the seasoned outsourcing expertise to guide the organization through the outsourcing lifecycle. Most organizational processes and procedures are based on vertical business structures that are obsolete in the new virtual outsourcing world, but they continue to view outsourcing through the eyes of individual department silos, each posturing to protect its own empire. Outsourcing vendors, through dealing with numerous clients, have mastered the art of maximizing their positions with clients. They sometimes lead unsophisticated clients down a path that maximizes their own profits while creating huge barriers to exit for the client, and negatively impacting the client's business and competitive position. Using outside professionals with proven track records established through several global outsourcing initiatives is money well invested and should pay dividends throughout the outsourcing project. External outsourcing professionals should have strong educational qualifications in business and technology, with detailed knowledge of several cross-functional disciplines, including supply management, engineering, IT, finance, quality operations, and contracts. They must have experience dealing with different cultures and have a high level of business acumen and technology knowledge in the global marketplace. We will continue with the next 5 traps of outsourcing in the next lecture. Let's continue with the next 5 traps of outsourcing. Not dedicating the best and brightest internal resources. Although experienced external outsourcing professionals can help guide organizations through the outsourcing lifecycle, there is no substitute for high-performing internal candidates to form the core of the outsourcing team. These individuals understand the organization's culture, marketplace, products, processes, and procedures. Too often organizations form their outsourcing teams using personnel at the lower range of the performance spectrum, perhaps personnel awaiting retirement or displaying problems that management has not had the courage to deal with. It is critical that candidates come from all cross-functional disciplines including finance, IT, engineering, operations, supply management, quality assurance, human resources, and contracts. This cross-functional team will provide a comprehensive view of the business requirements and corresponding points of view. Managers must be prepared to release key personnel from their day-to-day responsibilities in order to focus on the outsourcing initiative. Instead, managers are often reluctant to release high performance because they fear the impact on existing projects and that key employees will not return to their former roles. But the outsourcing initiative must take priority even though it may very well impact existing project commitments. If the right mix of personnel is not represented in the initiative, deficiencies may be uncovered after vendor selection and contract execution that will negatively impact the project. It is critical that management recognize, compensate, and articulate the organizational importance of these positions in order to attract high-performance candidates. It is equally important that these candidates believe their involvement with the outsourcing initiative will be a career enhancement and not a management wasteland assignment. For each stage of the outsourcing lifecycle, it is important to have the right team in place to oversee the efforts. The composition of the outsourcing team may change over time as the organization advances through the various stages. Rushing through the initiative. In anticipation of reaping the benefits of outsourcing, management may push the outsourcing team to rush through the organizational assessment, requirements, requests for proposals, vendor selection, and contract phases of the outsourcing lifecycle. This is often a grievous error. Instead, organizations must follow a disciplined approach when assessing their organizational readiness for the outsourcing initiative, creating outsourcing functional requirements, developing vendor evaluation requirements, preparing a clear RFP, evaluating vendor proposals, and completing contract negotiations with the best vendor. These steps are the foundation of the outsourcing initiative. The creation, review, and approval of these steps admittedly requires a huge commitment of employee resources, time and money, but rushing through them may result in conflicts in the relationship management phase, where the organization may be at the greatest risk from a financial and competitiveness perspective. In many situations, we have witnessed companies jump into outsourcing efforts without clearly outlining critical factors such as vendor financial stability assessment, definition of service level agreements, intellectual property rights, audit rights, and dispute resolution processes. This is just a sample of factors that must be identified and resolved in order to establish a successful outsourcing relationship, factors that we will explore in the next lectures. During these critical outsourcing lifecycle phases, the client organization is in the driver's seat and has the control to document requirements, create a detailed request for proposal, select vendors, and propose contract terms that clearly set business requirements and expectations. Rushing through these steps can be detrimental to the initiative and in some cases create irrevocable damage. Not appreciating cultural differences. One of the most difficult and underestimated issues facing outsourcing relationships is the impact of cultural differences between the client and vendor organizations. Client organizations scour the world for outsourcing partners, often considering vendors in India, Ireland, Israel, China, Mexico, Canada, and the Philippines. Clients tend to believe that the norms, values, and ethics of their vendors will be similar to their own. Once into the relationship, they realize that the vendor's views of time management, organizational structure, business approach, decision-making processes, long-term cooperation, and teamwork may be very different from their own. As India emerges as the global outsourcing leader, UK or US companies may not fully understand or appreciate some cultural differences. Indian companies are hesitant to tell their UK or US clients that they do not have the capabilities to execute an assignment or that they are experiencing problems during a project. The clients may not know until the final days before a milestone that the project is not on schedule or that there are significant cost overruns or functional deficiencies in the deliverable. This is not a function of the Indian vendor being dishonest, but of the vendor believing it can recover in the later stages of the project and not wanting to give bad news or disappoint the client. Many offshore outsourcing relationships get into trouble due to cultural differences where both the client and vendor organizations believe they are fulfilling their obligations, yet both sides end up being disappointed with the results and frustrated with the relationship. If these issues are not addressed and resolved in a timely manner, the relationship is destined to finger-pointing, low productivity, and mutual dissatisfaction. It is important to note that cultural differences occur even between organizations in different industries and even with organizations in the same country. Speaking to executives in Boston is not exactly the same as negotiating a deal with a Texan. Moreover, cultures in IT companies differ from those in the manufacturing sector, which differ from those in the financial sector. Minimizing the vendor productivity. Client organizations build business processes, methodologies, tools, infrastructures, products, and applications over years of an evolutionary process, but they are usually not disciplined in documenting and codifying the intellectual know-how. This knowledge is often scattered throughout all levels of the company, from senior engineers to inventory stock personnel. Is it realistic to believe that this know-how can readily be transferred to a vendor thousands of miles away in a different country with a different culture? Many clients' organizations minimize the time and effort it takes to document their know-how and to transfer it to their vendors. They set unrealistic goals for vendors in the early stages of the outsourcing relationship that create conflict and tension in the relationship before it is established. Organizations tend to set stringent service level agreements to be achieved in the early phase of the outsourcing transition. Usually these agreements require detailed knowledge of the client's business processes and functions. Is it realistic to believe this can happen in a short time frame? Think about the impact to a company that transfers a critical business application to a vendor and then either moves or loses the internal knowledge to support the application prior to the vendor demonstrating its own knowledge of the project. This could have a devastating effect on the client's business and jeopardize the outsourcing relationship. Client organizations must set realistic goals that allow the vendor to improve schedules, quality, and cost over time, based on objective metrics mutually agreed upon by both the client and vendor organizations. Poor relationship management programs. Organizations expend resources on the outsourcing strategy, selecting vendors and negotiating contracts without realizing that this is only the ante to get into the outsourcing game. They need to understand how to manage the ongoing outsourcing relationship. The relationship management plan is the glue that holds the outsourcing relationship together. It includes descriptions of the outsourcing efforts, identification of key shareholders, schedule of activities, roles and responsibilities, budgets, performance measurements, work products, resources, required skills and knowledge, change control process, quality assurance, configuration management, communication plan and tools, equipment, facilities, and security. The outsourcing relationship management plan, in effect, encapsulates the entire outsourcing relationship. The relationship management plan should not be an afterthought following the signing of the contract, but should be developed at the first stage of the outsourcing lifecycle and revised at subsequent stages. This ensures that the strategies and business structures can be molded into an objective, manageable framework that can be communicated throughout the client and vendor organizations. Let's discuss in this lecture the outsourcing lifecycle stages of outsourcing. There are several reasons why we discuss outsourcing using a process-driven approach. First, a process-driven approach provides you with a systemic look at the how-to details of developing an outsourcing plan. Second, regardless of the nature of the outsourcing arrangement, whether it is small or large, onshore or offshore, is functional or competency-based, the steps in the process need to be followed to ensure that you are being diligent in the management of the outsourcing relationship. And third, while the components of the outsourcing process do not change over time or between projects, one thing that should change is the effectiveness and efficiency of the process. Through practice, experience, and time, an organization should increase the maturity and sophistication of how it goes through the various stages of the outsourcing lifecycle. Having a process framework provides you with a consistent view of the details of the outsourcing engagement. The framework should be used to move through outsourcing engagements and improve for better results. The outsourcing lifecycle is made up of the following stages shown in this figure. First, strategic assessment, then needs analysis, vendor assessment, negotiation and contract management, project initiation and transition, relationship management, continuous modification or exit strategies. Each of the stages of outsourcing has subcomponents and subprocesses that need attention. Outsourcing must be considered as a strategic tool for the organization to employ to increase its competitiveness and performance in the marketplace. For effective outsourcing, the initiative must be evaluated in the context of the strategic posture of the organization. This strategic assessment is the focal activity in the first stage of the outsourcing process. During the strategic assessment stage, the organization makes a business case clearly identifying the intended benefits of employing outsourcing as a strategy. Doing this will require the organization to analyze its core competencies and identify areas that are suitable for outsourcing, put in place an executive team and conduct operational, financial, and risk assessment. Once a business case for outsourcing is presented and agreed upon, you are ready to get into the act of actually outsourcing. When you have completed the strategic assessment, there might be many possible candidate areas or projects within the company that you think are ripe for outsourcing. In the next step, you must pick your battles, so to speak. This would involve prioritizing your needs and defining at an operational level the one or more outsourcing projects that you would like to focus on. For each such project, the next stage is to conduct a thorough needs analysis. Needs analysis is akin to a strategic assessment made at the first stage, but it is more detailed and concentrated for the specific project. Here you are looking at what the peculiarities of the given project are and how you can best articulate the requirements. Evaluate the requirements by mapping them to the broader business case prepared during the strategic assessment and prepare a proposal to articulate these needs to potential vendors. The third stage is one of soliciting, evaluating, and choosing the vendor for your outsourcing needs. The vendor selection and contracting phase provides a structured framework to guide the organization through critical vendor selection and contracting activities. Choosing the right vendor is much like choosing a good partner. The chances are that if you make the right decision from the onset, you will have a potentially lasting relationship, while choosing the wrong vendor could damage and thwart a well-intentioned outsourcing project. Once a vendor is chosen, the next steps are to engage in negotiations until an agreement is reached about the details of the outsourcing work. This is followed by the composition of the outsourcing contract, the legal document that codifies the nature and scope of the business relationship. During the negotiation and contract stage, the focus is on securing a legally binding deal that is documented and not just verbally arranged, which is best for all parties involved in the relationship. Once all the T's are crossed and I's are dotted, and the business partners sign on the dotted lines, you are ready to begin the outsourcing project, the project initiation and transition phase. The stages of project initiation and transition are the most seminal stages of the outsourcing relationship. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is the stage where the client organization slowly starts to relinquish control of the work to the outsourcing vendor. The initial stages of the outsourcing relationship require diligent attention to deal with emergent issues and smooth out any problems that occur. This is the stage that marks the foundation of the continued relationship. Hence, it is important to address problems up front rather than letting issues escalate. After the initial stages, the outsourcing relationship should become routine enough for you to begin managing the day-to-day operations of the relationship, also called governance. The focus of this stage is to keep up to date with the outsourcing relationship. The salient activities in this stage include evaluation of the relationship, problem resolution, communications management, knowledge management, and process management. While management of the relationship is a continuous process, occasionally the client organization may face events that require it to pause and evaluate the future of the relationship. Events could be items such as new strategic alliances, changes to the vendor's business, or innovations in the marketplace. An organization must evaluate its current outsourcing contract to see if its best interest lies in continuing, modifying, or exiting the relationship. Choosing any one of these alternatives will call for reconnecting to the first stage of the life cycle and reconducting a strategic assessment to repeat the life cycle. Here are some considerations. Before getting into each stage of the outsourcing life cycle, some critical points need to be made. First, the outsourcing process is cyclical and it is important to follow through on each stage in the prescribed manner. It will be futile to omit a stage, as your organization will miss out any benefits of following a well-organized life cycle. One of the reasons why we recommend following the stages in order is that this is greatly reduces difficult decisions making as you move through the model. When an organization first considers using outsourcing as a strategic tool, there are an unlimited number of possibilities to analyze. Put another way, finding the right solution that works for the organization is difficult, as the solution search space is seemingly vast and unlimited. Second, each stage of the outsourcing process, except for the last one on choosing to continue, modify, or exit the relationship, must be conducted independent of the stage that follows it. Why is this important? Simply because it is not beneficial to conduct a stage with a preconceived answer on what you will do at a future stage. Put another way, you do not just want to go through the process if you already know the answer, or worse, tweak the process to arrive at a preconceived answer. Finally, mastering the outsourcing lifecycle is both a science and an art. The science part comes from well-defined principles that need to be followed for success in outsourcing. These include not rushing through the process, knowing where you are before engaging in negotiating, paying attention to communication and problem resolution during the project initiation phase, managing knowledge to improve the process, and many other details, which we will make clear in next lecture. Given the general principles, management is often an art. What works in one situation may not work in another. The best practices outlined here have been deduced from many studies of a number of outsourcing engagements. Rather than being specific in terms of naming organizations that have put these practices in place, we'll opt to present the practices in general. This will help us avoid issues such as showing favoritism or endorsing any one organization. After all, an organization may be good at one thing in one context and may have hopelessly inadequate practices in another context. Outsourcing for business value and strategic advantages. First, you need to be clear about the rationale for outsourcing. Do not outsource for meager operational issues or short-term benefits, such as short-term and immediate cost benefits. In this situation, the cost of carrying out the outsourcing endeavor will far outweigh any benefits you plan on receiving. When outsourcing, it is absolutely critical to ensure that the outsourcing project is in keeping with the current strategic position of your organization and with its future directions. It is equally important to ensure that when they outsource, organizations are contributing to their business value and also increasing strategic advantages. Anything short of this will lead them to conduct a rather expensive outsourcing endeavor with new, if any, long-term lasting benefits. If your organization's senior executives are not convinced about the business value of the outsourcing effort, or if they think the project is not important enough for them to get involved in, they will not actively take part in the effort, and this negative signal will doom the outsourcing effort from the onset. Specify your needs. Do not have it done for you. It must be clear who is outsourcing to whom. You must be in charge of defining the needs and goals of the outsourcing project. Too often companies fail to realize the importance of taking the first steps and spending the due resources needed to clearly specify their needs upfront. Failure to specify your organization's needs properly results in an incomplete and poor negotiation session with the vendor. This is where the vendor organization has the greatest potential to leverage its own position by being helpful and specifying your requirements for you. The chances are high that vendors will specify things that they can do and do well, and will avoid paying attention to areas where they lack competency. After all, they want your business. In the end, you will get a product or service out of the outsourcing relationship that you happen to agree to but never really needed. Shop around for a vendor using multiple criteria. Do not ever shop around for a vendor using just a single criterion. Most often, this criterion is cost. As illogical as this may seem, most organizations first pre-screen vendors based on cost. Vendors will always lowball present low costs in the beginning. This is because they know that organizations will pre-screen incoming bids based on costs. A vendor who offers a lower price than everyone else may be very good at what it does, but the chances of this are low, unless you are hearing from an industry leader with an established reputation. Most of the time, vendors who lowball on price are usually desperate for new business and will say anything to get a signed contract. After you have signed on that dotted line, you will pay more in terms of receiving a lower quality product or service. Vendors must be evaluated on multiple criteria such as quality, reputation, and experiences, with cost as the last factor. Negotiate and contract for a win-win situation. Remember that you are entering into a relationship with a business partner. The chances of the success of this relationship are higher when both parties are in a win-win situation. This is the same rule that we will follow in formalizing personal relationships. When negotiating and developing a contract, you must not get too selfish and try to squeeze maximal returns from the vendor, as any such gains will only be on paper and not during the lifetime of the relationship. A vendor is your business partner and must want to sustain the relationship just as much as you do, because it is winning from the relationship as well. Do not be rigid during project initiation and transition. The initial stages of outsourcing are fraught with chaotic and confusing behavior. Experienced outsourcing practitioners know that this is to be expected and part of the business. It is the inexperienced managers who panic and get overly concerned and become rigid on their handling of the situation, constantly seeking answers for problems by referring to the construct. Flexibility is the predominant characteristic required to get through the initial stages of the outsourcing work. Managers must recognize that this is a stage where two organizations that have never interacted before are joining forces. Areas of friction must be accepted and used positively to build a bearing future relationship. Have well-defined metrics. Measurement is important and often overlooked by novices in outsourcing. It is essential to have a well-defined and agreed metrics to evaluate the stage of the outsourcing relationship. Metrics take the guesswork out of the outsourcing engagement and give critical indicators against which to benchmark performance. Metrics need to be simple, concrete, and comprehensive and must account for the process and output aspects of the outsourcing efforts. Always have a viable exit strategy. Plan ahead by assuming that there will be problems and you may have to exit the relationship urgently with possible hostility involved. It is crucial to have an exit strategy from the very onset when getting into an outsourcing relationship. After all, you cannot control the future of your vendor or business partner. Unusual circumstances may result in the vendor not being able to perform its tasks or in your no longer wanting to continue the relationship. In situations like this, you must have a backup plan that can be activated. Do not make the mistake of assuming that your vendor is thoughtful and has a backup strategy in place to attend to your needs. The bottom line is, do not start an outsourcing relationship without having an exit strategy handy. Do not be content with the process. Improve continuously. Improvement of the outsourcing process must be a continuous quest. Any process can be improved or built upon. It will be unwise to claim that an outsourcing process has reached its optimal level. You may have a very good outsourcing process in place, but there are always things that can be done better. It is through embracing these improvements that you will improve the overall process. It is our belief that an organization's outsourcing capability is going to be a strategic differentiator. This is where how good your process is compared to others in your industries make a difference. You must be ready to be the best and work towards it. The future of outsourcing is bright. There are several things that will occur in the immediate future. First, the backlash and emotional stances regarding the outsourcing of knowledge work will come to an end because of the simple reality that the economics of outsourcing outweigh these concerns significantly. Second, the transformation of outsourcing knowledge work such as software development and R&D activities will increase and become more accepted. This will pave the way for organizations to become more comfortable outsourcing more complex matters and matters of greater significance, such as core competences. Third, the outsourcing decision, which is currently dominated by cost considerations, will shift to one of knowledge considerations, who the expert in a domain is, rather than who is the lowest cost provider. And finally, there will be leaders and laggards in any given industry, based on how effective their outsourcing programs are. This is bound to happen as more organizations become decentralized and based on variable cost rather than fixed cost models, to meet the characteristics of a dynamic marketplace. As for the distant future, we do not want to postulate anything, as we would still have to get out a crystal ball.